Please welcome Jeffrey Phillips.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I hope I can live up to that introduction. Thank you, Jane. So whenever you're the keynote speaker, that sounds really important. You get to kick off the morning, so I feel a lot of pressure. Jane always calls me and says, will you be a keynote? And I think it's a lot of pressure to kick off a big event in the morning because people are just getting up, but they're full of anticipation about the day. So I'm going to do my best to try to sort of entertain you, as well as give you some ideas about what we think about not only innovation, but competition in the future. This mic sounds just a little loud. Could we take it down just a little bit? Is that better? Thank you. There will be audience participation during the event. The universal sign of acknowledgement is this. If you agree, and the universal sign of acknowledgement would be this if you disagree. So I may ask you every once in a while to agree or disagree with something. It's always good to get feedback from the audience, make sure you're following along and haven't fallen asleep. Although occasionally this nod can be confused for falling asleep or paying attention. Just a couple things about me. I like to keep it really informal. I will leave some time for questions at the end. If you have some questions, I'd be glad to take them. I tend to do things fairly informally, and I'll probably wander around a lot because I talk with my hands and my feet better than just standing behind a podium. Sorry if that's annoying, but that's the way we'll do it. As Jane said, I've been in the innovation space for about 12 years, worked with a lot of different companies. In fact, I was telling her a story that just last week I was with a major consumer products company. And we were talking about innovation and the struggles they had to innovate. And they said, many of the scientists that were in the room said, well, we have a lot of interesting ideas and knowledge, but the problem is we don't know how to share them. And new people come into our organization and they have a hard time finding out what we know and what we've done before. And I said, that sounds a lot like knowledge management. And they looked at me and said, we're about to kick off a project in knowledge management. So I thought, how timely that I was going to come speak to you guys. Well, what I wanted to spend some time on today is this idea of OutManeuver. And before we spend some time on OutManeuver, I want to recognize my co-author who's with me in the audience. Alex, please stand up. This is Alex Orhosky. He'll be with me if you are for the book signing. Please welcome Alex. Thank you. So I'll say that I co-wrote the book with Alex, and Alex approached me a while ago and said, hey, I have this idea about how to apply some tactics from the military into business vernacular, especially about what we're facing. And you may think, well, does the military and business, do those two things go together? And the interesting thing is, if you look at how we operate in most businesses, we adopt everything from the military. We adopt things like strategy. Strategy is originally from the military. We adopt insight. So going and getting competitive intelligence is an idea from the military. If you look at our organizational structures, the hierarchical structures that most organizations have, they come directly from the military. So I'm not going to bore you if you're not a military person with a lot of stories. There will be one short one. But one of the things that we discovered as Alex and I were talking is that there's a lot of things that we can learn from how the military thinks about competition, but more importantly, a new method or a new strategy for competing. And we're going to call that OutManeuver. So with all that said, there's a couple of things that are really interesting right now, and I'm going to be talking about innovation because that's core to what I do, but I want to talk a little bit more about a bigger idea around competition and competitive strategy. There are a couple of things that are unfolding right now that are actually really interesting if you're watching closely. The first statement there was said by a CEO of a major corporation that you might not expect. So the future belongs to the fast. Does anybody know who said that? It was somebody you wouldn't expect. Nobody knows? Meg Whitman, who's the CEO of HP, said the future belongs to the fast. Now, how many of you think HP is fast? None of you do, right? None of you do, but she gets it. She's saying, hey, we got to move faster. And the world is moving faster. And if we don't start speeding up our processes and our capabilities to deliver, then we're toast. This is HP saying this. So, but the interesting thing is, let's say I go faster, but I'm not able to adjust to the changes that are happening in the marketplace or the roadblocks. So it's not just speed that's important. What we like to call agility is important. The ability to stay moving quickly, to continue to move quickly, but to then adjust to what's going on. Let's call that agility, which is why I have the cheetah there, because they can move pretty fast, but they can also zigzag when they need to. But if you think about that as a business, if I have to move fast and I have to be agile, then I need to know where I'm going, right? Just going fast or being agile isn't enough. I have to be able to know where to go because I have a lot of options in front of me, which means I need something that a lot of businesses don't have in great wealth today. They don't have a lot of insight. And we're going to talk a little bit about insight. And then in the final analysis, let's say I'm really fast and I get to where the future is before any other competitors do, and I jumped over all the hurdles and I had a lot of insight, but I arrive with nothing new. Right? Let's say I'm HP and I arrive with an outdated PC, but I got there faster than anybody else. I still don't win. Because the other expectation that all of you out here have is all of us have eagerly waited the iPhone 7 or some new device. So I have to not only get there faster with greater speed and greater agility, but I also have to arrive with something that's interesting and valuable to the consumer. So I need to innovate as well. These four factors, speed and agility and insight and innovation, are really what we think of as the new competitive reality. This is what your business needs in order to succeed. We're going to talk about each of these briefly. So the pace of change. The pace of change is incredible, and I wrote down some numbers. I'm going to look them up here in a sheet of paper in just a second. But if you look at the adoption rates of technology, so it took about 60 years for the television to really penetrate about 70-80% of households. It took about 30 years for email to do so. It took about 8 minutes for Facebook to do the same thing. Not really, but it feels that way, right? But if you look at how fast technology is changing and how fast change is accelerating, it's pretty scary. So the numbers are, I'll read these numbers to you because I had to write them down. In 1960, the average lifespan of a firm on the S&P 500 was about 60 years. That's how long a firm on the S&P would stay on the S&P, about 60 years. By 1980, the average tenure was 25. So more than halved in less than 20 years. Today, it's about 18. So what you can see is the longevity, the expected longevity of a major firm to stay on the S&P 500 is 2/3 less than what it was even just 40 or 50 years ago. We're all facing that need and the need to change. And the fact of the matter is that change is accelerating. So if you're moving at 33 RPM, for those of you who remember those record players? A lot of people are like, what's a record player? Some of us are still moving at 33 when some others are moving at 45 and some are moving at 78. We've got to accelerate, and we've got to be able to do that. But more importantly, as I said earlier, it's not just about speed. Speed without agility just means you crash faster. So what we have to be able to do is to adjust at speed to the things that are occurring, the kinds of things that are changing. And this is important too, understanding how to be agile. What happens in American business today, and some of you may be from other places, and you'll probably face the same thing, is that we've gotten really good at being really efficient by locking into specific kinds of activities. And that lock-in makes you really efficient, but it also makes you far less agile. So what we're going to have to do is figure out how to be much more efficient and more agile at the same time. And that means devolving responsibility and authority, pushing it down. It means allowing people to make decisions closer to the action of what's happening or what the customer need is, and being able to really turn those decisions quickly, which means in a bureaucratic organization, there needs to be some change. The third thing, and one of the more interesting things, and where it's really relevant here to a certain extent, is this idea of insight. So the question is, as we're competing, what do we know and what do our competitors know? And what do we know that inside our organization we're not taking advantage of? Or how do we get to information that perhaps other people have? And more importantly, when I take all that insight together, how do I make decisions on it? And here's the truth of the matter. Most organizations know an awful lot about what just happened. That's the whole, to a great extent. We've been really good at knowing what just happened yesterday or the day before or a week ago and being able to slice and dice that data. What we're not doing so well yet, and what we need to be able to do if you're going to compete in this kind of future, the kind of future I'm defining, is to be able to say, what do we think is going to happen next and how do we get ahead of it? Insight is really about how do I get ahead of what's going to happen next and how do I get there before anybody else does? So this is really an interesting question. Where does all that information come from? Where do I get that insight? How do I spend time gathering insights and trends and building scenarios so I can begin to predict what's going to happen and get there before anybody else does? So insight is important. And then the last one, obviously, that, where my ultimate passion really lies, all of these things matter, but getting there early, getting there fast, getting there with insight is interesting. What's really interesting is getting there with something that's really compelling. Understanding customer needs, understanding what they want, being able to build a product or service or business model or create an experience that people want, that they say, hey, that's really valuable to me. So I can get there early, but if I get there early with nothing new, it's no better for me or for the consumer. Really what you have to do is think about these 4 attributes I've just talked about in combination. And you need to be good at all of them. It's not a question of being good at 1 or 2, say we're really fast, but we're not innovative. No good. We're really innovative, but we're really slow. Not so good either. So, the thing we're going to see is that all these things come together. And what we know for sure is that very few firms have many of these skills. We've encountered very few that have all of these skills. So if you think about this idea of OutManeuver, what I was talking about earlier, setting up this idea of how do you compete in the future, then we're going to argue for the rest of this presentation that these 4 factors are what create the ability to outmaneuver your competition. So if you don't believe anything I've just told you, you can go ahead and have break now. So just go ahead. Anyone want to go? I'm losing somebody over there. He disagreed. Okay. 1 out of, I think Jane said there are 1,000, so there are 999 of you that agree with me and 1 guy who left. So I've got you so far. These are the 4 factors that we think are going to matter in the future. All right, so what do we do about that? Now that we've set up this idea that there are 4 kind of competitive realities or competitive advantages that are going to matter, what do we do about all that? Well, we can keep calm. We can choose to ignore what's going on. And we can do what I like to call business as usual. The problem over the last 20 or 30 years is that everything most businesses have done is to lock into very efficient processes. They've done ERP, they've done Six Sigma, they've done Lean, they've right-sized, they've outsourced, et cetera, et cetera. And what that's done is create very, very efficient, but very risk-averse, very slow-to-move processes, which are awesome if your goal is efficiency. It's not so great if the question is, how do we move more quickly and how do we create something that customers want in a way that we don't have them? But there's another thing I told you about where there's some relationships to the military, and we've inherited some things from the military. And one of the most important ones I want to talk about for just a second is called attrition. So how many of you grocery shop on a regular basis? Let's just grocery shop. So some of you don't eat or wash your hair. Okay. All right. Okay. Those of you sitting next to those people probably already are finding that out. But let's imagine going down the grocery store aisle and looking at shampoos. Let's just choose that as an example. Is there a lot of choice in most grocery stores for shampoos? Yeah, there's tons of choice. But what's happening is that if you look at the product by product, selection by selection, you're finding that most of them use the same ingredients, most of them have roughly the same price points, and they compete with each other basically on advertising or price promotions or things like that. So there's a phrase in the military that we inherit from the military that we use in business competition called attrition. Attrition is nothing, it's just a big word, it's a dime word that means head-to-head competition. And most competition, whether we use shampoos in a grocery store or whatever products and services your company makes, or anybody in here, more than likely you have a competitor with whom you compete, and your product development team lines up a set of product features and says, okay, we have these product features and they have these product features, therefore we're going to compete. The problem with attrition is that when you compete head-to-head, feature-to-feature, eventually the only thing that's left is, okay, I'm going to cut costs or I'm going to add more marketing or more advertising in order to win. Now, this idea of attrition is not new. In fact, attrition goes back quite a way, and I'm going to segue for 2 seconds. This will be the only military analogy I use, but I felt like I had to throw it in because I wanted you to get a sense of what attrition looks like. So in the First World War, Germany attacks France, and there's this fort. That's a picture of the fort at Verdun. Maybe some of you have heard of Verdun. So they decide, we're going to beat France. And so they go to France and they attack this fort at Verdun. 300 days later, the front hasn't moved at all. They're still attacking Verdun. 300,000 people have died. Over 1 million casualties. And the front hasn't moved. And the German army said, we're going to bleed France white. In other words, we're going to wipe out their army. So the Germans are nothing if not quick learners. 20 years later, they come back to Verdun, and what do? They go around it, right? They go around it. And in the First World War, their target was the French army. We're going to wipe out the French army. That's attrition. I'm going to kill more of yours than you can kill of mine. In the Second World War, their target is the French government. I'm going to get to Paris and cause the government to collapse, and then all the soldiers will go home. It's a completely different way of fighting, completely different theory, right? The first time, I'm going to fight you toe-to-toe for as long as it takes to win. That's attrition. The second time, I'm going to go around your fort, I'm going to go make the government collapse, and then all the soldiers will go home. That's maneuver. Do you guys understand the difference? Very simple example. One is toe-to-toe and like two boxers in a boxing ring going at each other for hours and hours. The other, I'm going to go around it, I'm going to find a different way to win that's less costly. Muhammad Ali made this famous with the rope-a-dope. Everybody used to go toe-to-toe in the boxing ring. Muhammad Ali would dance around until the guy got tired and he'd win. That's the difference between attrition and what we're going to call maneuver. So hopefully that wasn't too boring for you from a military analogy. So who wins when you do attrition? Who's likely to win when you do attrition? Well, why do big companies like attrition? Because they can wear the other firm out. I've got deeper pockets than you do, and I'll just go head-to-head with you until you get out of my market. Or I have a more solid position than you do. I've been entrenched longer, and I have more reputation than you do. So if you look at it, big firms will always choose attrition first because it's the easiest way to win. I have more reputation, I have deeper pockets, and by the way, I have a lot of inertia. So trying to win in a different way is more difficult for a larger firm. Doesn't mean that they all are always going to compete that way, but in general, attrition favors a larger firm that's a little bit more slow-moving or has deeper pockets. All right, the problem with attrition, the problem with the way we compete today is that it is very expensive. In the Verdun example, I said 300,000 people died at Verdun in World War I. Hardly anyone died in World War II because they went and took the government before the French army could even begin to fight. In attrition success, if you gain market share, and in many of your cases out here in this audience, there are people back at the office, wherever you're from, who are worrying about winning 1 point of market share. And they're right to do that. How do I gain a few more points of market share? Those few points of market share are really expensive because they're competing feature to feature, product to product line to product line in the same places with the same competitive strategies that their competition is. And somewhere on the other side, your competition's asking the same questions. So when these two firms begin to slug it out over the same products with the same features, with the same strategies, they lose. And what we're trying to do is set up a new kind of thinking. How about if we find the way to go around or maneuver in such a way that we can win at far less cost? So we're going to talk a little bit later about what we call winning on the cheap. The idea of outmaneuvering your competition is about winning with far less cost and in far less time. So I'll go even further, although I didn't say this. There's actually a noted military theorist who said, attrition, whenever you see attrition, it's the absence of strategy. Because you don't have to really plan to compete on an attrition basis. All I have to do is see what the enemy's doing or my competitor's doing, match them, and then go head to head and see who has the deepest pockets. That doesn't take a lot of strategy. So one of the gentlemen we used as a source for some of the things we've written in the book was really about the fact that attrition, whenever you see attrition happening, it's sort of a signal that unless those two companies are just trying to drive each other into the ground, there really isn't a lot of strategy at play or at work there. So attrition isn't very thoughtful. It doesn't take a lot of creativity. It doesn't take a lot of speed. It doesn't take a lot of insight. But it's very expensive. And it's very hard to win an attrition battle. So what I want to do then is, okay, we've set up this idea, and maybe you're saying, well, yeah, you've set up a straw man, but I get it. That attrition stuff, that sounds pretty bad. And I even recognize some of the things you're talking about, like competing product to product, feature to feature. I understand that. That does sound a little crazy. What's an alternative? So what we're going to spend the rest of the time is talking about an alternative, and I'm going to try to give you a couple of examples of what maneuver looks like, and then how you might apply maneuver into these kinds of settings. So since we're at a hotel, why not use the hotel industry as an example? I would argue that most hotel chains are in an attrition battle right now. If we went to another hotel right across the street, it would probably have a nice ballroom. It would probably have nice hotel rooms. It would probably have a restaurant. In other words, any hotel within the downtown area that can host a conference probably has a lot of the same features and attributes and functions as this hotel does. And basically what you're doing is you're buying a brand name, or for a while they were trying to convince you to come along for points. So I want to talk about the hotel industry and talk about how one company is outmaneuvering them. So if we think about it, let's just think about this hotel or any hotel. Any of these have certain attributes or functions that they compete with in order to win your business. Some of those things may be things like a location. I want to have a hotel close to downtown. Or it may be the quality of the rooms, or it may be the little trinkets you get in the room, or the little chocolate that they leave on your pillow. Everybody get chocolate on their pillow? I did. Yeah. If you didn't want yours, I'll take it later. Is there a restaurant there? I like to work out, so is there a gym at the hotel? More than likely, you're going to find that any of those hotels in a downtown area that can host a conference have all these things. So then how do you choose? Well, then it becomes a question of, well, I choose, personally, sorry about that, I choose because of the rewards. I happen to be a Marriott rewards points person, so I like Marriott because I get rewards, and I'll tend to stay in Marriotts more. But Hilton also has a rewards program, et cetera, et cetera. The fact of the matter is that nothing about this industry has changed since Conrad Hilton and others began to brand hotels close to 100 years ago. It's not to say it's a bad industry, it's a great industry. But imagine another firm comes along. Let's just think about one. How many of you in here have actually used Airbnb? Anyone? How many of you had a bad experience at Airbnb? One or two? Oh, that's fair. How many of you have ever had a bad experience with a hotel? Okay, so we can say that, not to castigate hotels or Airbnb, but the fact of the matter is that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about how Airbnb is a master of what we call maneuver. Now remember, we talked about there's sort of four things, right? There's speed, there's agility, there's insight, and there's innovation. So if you just stop and think about this for a second, which companies, say 7 to 10 years ago, were the most likely to figure out how to rent rooms? This is an audience participation question at this point. I've even given you the answer. You want me to go back? Who was already renting rooms to people? Hotels were, right? But they got locked into a way of thinking. Well, we have to either own the building or have approved the building or have had the building built to our specifications and then licensed to somebody else. But we have reservation systems, and we have quality control systems, and we have billing systems, and we have all these things that, could they have extended those to people who wanted to rent their rooms out? And would I have been more likely as a Marriott person to say, oh, Marriott's got this new program where they're renting out bedrooms to people, but I trust the Marriott brand. So how on earth does a hotel chain who has all these capabilities ignore this marketplace? Well, we're going to talk about a couple things here, right? At Airbnb, there's a lot of things you don't get. You may not get a gym. You may not get chocolate on your pillow. But what you are going to get is, generally speaking, a safe, comfortable, convenient place. And in some cases, you're going to get a place that is more, say, local, more attuned to what's going on in the place. Or maybe you'll get some advice from the people who own the Airbnb who'll tell you about the best restaurants and so forth. But the interesting thing is, a lot of the features and benefits you're going to get from Airbnb are exactly what you're going to get from a hotel. And by the way, they have many of the same requirements, not all. And we could talk a little bit about the differences between licensing and legal issues that Airbnb is facing in some places. But for the most part, your expectation is I'm going to get a comfortable, clean, safe place to stay, just like I would in a hotel, but something might be interesting or different or more local or have a local feel or something along those lines. Airbnb competes to a great extent almost directly with hotels, but yet its growth and its opportunities are radically different. So let's ask ourselves a question. Did Airbnb outmaneuver the hotel industry? So one of the questions you ask is, did someone else have a chance to get into this market? And the answer would be, you're nodding of your heads like this. Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of people and a lot of companies that had a chance to get into this market and either overlooked it or ignored it or said, that's not in our business model. We don't want to take on renting somebody else's house. Was the movement of this new entrant, was it unexpected? Like, who is Airbnb? Do you guys know the story of Airbnb? Three guys. Okay, a quick story about Airbnb. How did Airbnb originate? Three guys living in New York who noticed that all the hotels are full because there's a conference. And two of them look at their friend and say, what if we were to put an airbed in our spare room and rent it out? That's the story of Airbnb. That's how it got started. Literally, Airbnb means airbed and breakfast. So you go back and look it up. That's how they got started. Three guys in a little apartment in New York who saw a need and moved on it. But they win at far less cost, because they don't have investments in hotels. They don't have investments in all these things that hotels have. So they found a way to provide everything that you might want or expect, except perhaps points, from a hotel. Good overnight stays at an equivalent price, but they had very little investment. I didn't have to go build a single hotel. I didn't have to even go license a single hotel. In fact, you, the homeowner, are responsible for maintenance and upkeep and all that stuff. Right? So my investment, my out-of-pocket investment is low, allowing me to move faster and be more agile because I'm not locked into a bunch of stuff. So how's it worked? How does it work when someone practicing maneuver actually gets into a market? Well, today, this is actually about 6 months ago, but you can see the growth in guests. Last I looked, Airbnb had about the same capitalization as Marriott. And so I think they're doing pretty well from a financial point of view. This is a great map I like. The red dots show you where you can stay with Airbnb in the greater New York City area. The yellow shows where you can stay with a branded hotel. So you want to stay in Brooklyn and Park Slope, there's 40 places to stay. You want to stay in Upper Manhattan, there's 60 apartments for rent, et cetera, et cetera. Stay where you want. Be a local. That's part of their point. My favorite one is this. This is, of course, the Airbnb guys now. They've been a bit successful, so they're going to poke the bear a little bit, right? So Brian Chesky is the CEO, and he noticed that Marriott was claiming they're going to add 30,000 rooms in a year. So we're going to add 30,000 rooms in a year. Chesky comes out, and this is from his Twitter account. He says, we'll add that many next week. Talk about fast. Talk about agile. If they decide they don't want to work in a particular city or state anymore, they just pull out. They just don't take reservations there anymore. Whereas if Marriott or Hilton are there, they've got this infrastructure that they have to support. They can move more quickly, they can be more agile, and they can do these kinds of things in a way that the larger competitors can't. Okay. I've just used one example. I could use some others, and if you're interested, we talk about some others in our book. Companies like Zara, if many of you are familiar with Zara, the Israeli company Teva, who makes pharmaceuticals. There's plenty of other examples of companies that have been able to take on some of these attributes and move very quickly into spaces and overcome what look like sort of locked-in large competitors. So the question that we ought to ask ourselves, and you might be asking yourself, is, why am I here? No, that isn't the question. I hope that's not the question you're asking yourself. I hope the question you're asking yourself is, this sounds kind of interesting. Could we actually do this? I mean, is it possible, or do you have to be an Airbnb or an Uber or somebody like that in order to do it? And so what I want to do is give you a really high overview of what it takes to be a good maneuver practitioner. Now remember, we're comparing and contrasting attrition, which means head-to-head, toe-to-toe, feature-to-feature competition, with this idea of maneuvering, moving fast, being agile, and being creative and innovative. So what I want to do is give you just a few ideas about what it takes to be a maneuver strategist. The first thing you want to think about when you're maneuvering is, what are my opportunities? And I'm going to talk about, generally speaking, when you look at maneuvering, there are three kinds of opportunities. There's the idea of preemption. And actually, Airbnb uses preemption. Preemption is the idea that there's an opportunity in a space you're already serving that you're missing or overlooking. So Airbnb moved into the idea that, well, why do I have to have a building, right? I can give overnight stays to people who want to stay in a city, but I don't have to have a building. So preemption is moving into a valuable but unoccupied space. Dislocation is Verdun. The first time I fought Verdun, we fought toe-to-toe on that spot. The second time I went around it and made it pointless. Verdun is no longer interesting if the government doesn't support the fort, right? Does that make sense? Dislocation means I'm just going to make your strength unimportant. And the third one is also interesting, and we're actually seeing it happen right now in our politics, is disruption. I'm going to try to distract you so much through a lot of different actions that you're basically rendered sort of impotent. You can't move. You can't make good decisions. So these are the three selections, and we'll talk about each of them briefly. Preemption is the best one. Preemption is fighting and winning without ever even fighting. Because what happens is you move so quickly into a really valuable space that your competitors didn't see or didn't pay attention to, that by the time they figure out what happened, you've already won. This is winning without fighting. Because preemption is basically going into an unoccupied space and winning. Apple did this. You know, everyone likes to hold up Apple as an innovator. What people don't realize is that Apple completely disemboweled the entire music distribution business almost overnight. And they preempted a space where people used to go out and get tangible physical media, and suddenly made it all digital, and they did it in a way that was practical and legal. So they found a valuable and unoccupied space. I just talked about how Airbnb did the same thing. You may ask yourself, is there really a valuable and unoccupied space in my company's competitive landscape? And the answer is probably. Probably. And there's somebody out there right now trying to figure out what it is and how to take advantage of it. Because Uber and Airbnb, and we can use those as examples, but we use more in the book, we can talk about a lot of different kinds of companies who are looking for these valuable and unoccupied opportunities. And suddenly, what looked like a little niche, you know, when Marriott or Hilton saw Airbnb come along, they might have said, well, that's an interesting niche, but it won't ever amount to anything. When you realize that Airbnb has the same capitalization as some of the largest hotel firms in the world in only 6 or 7 years, you can begin to say, maybe there was more opportunity there than they thought. So every market has some kind of a valuable and unoccupied position. And many times, it will be something like what we would call an adjacency. Something that's just adjacent to where the company thinks its core strength is. Just like we said, I'm renting rooms, but could I rent rooms to other people? Or could I rent rooms in other ways? And can I rent rooms in buildings I don't own? This is the idea of an adjacency, being just adjacent to the conventional definition of the market. So there's really a couple of questions. Is there a reason the space isn't occupied? Well, the reason that the space wasn't occupied for what Airbnb did is because there was no rules around it. In fact, the way the industry is fighting back is to say, well, most cities don't allow for short-term rentals in homes. So if you look at the battles that are going on in all of your cities right now about Airbnb, that's the way the industry is fighting back. They're going to your city councils and saying, well, the reason this opportunity existed was because there weren't any laws. We want you to write some laws. And by the way, while you're at it, write some laws that are favorable to us, right? Keep them out. And the second question is, if it's valuable, can you sustain it? Can we build enough competitive advantage that we can sustain it? The interesting thing is Airbnb competed against firms that are very good firms, but they were very slow to react. And by the time they finally began to react, they were established enough and had enough of a brand name and were viewed as a bit of an upstart, and people sort of cheer for the upstarts that they were able to sustain that. Okay, so that's preemption. Preemption is winning without even fighting. I win before we even start fighting. Dislocation is the second opportunity. And dislocation is interesting because you basically look at a competitor and you identify weaknesses that if I just attack this one weakness, I can force that incumbent or that competitor to lose almost automatically. So I changed my definition of my enemy from the French army to the French government. And when the French government collapses, the French army collapses. I used, as an example here, one of my favorite things, as you can probably tell, I enjoy eating. I work out, but I enjoy eating too. But the new fad right now is a taco truck. So if you think about it, a taco truck is a perfect example of dislocation. Taco trucks dislocate restaurants that have gone in and done their duty and set up a place on the street corner somewhere where people go by for lunch or dinner. Because whoever has that physical restaurant has to pay taxes on that restaurant, they have to pay real estate costs on that restaurant, they have to do advertising in that space, and they have to hope that traffic will come by them at just at such a time. A taco truck pulls up a half hour before lunch, leaves a half hour after lunch. Pulls up a half hour before dinner, leaves a half hour after dinner, right? It shows up where the people are, not where it had its own real estate. So they are dislocating. They're a great example of coming in and dislocating an existing competitor. Because they can go, not only that, but they can go where a traditional restaurant can't. They can go to the food truck rodeo. So I can, as a food truck, I can go down and sit right in front of your restaurant just when the traffic is the highest and leave when the traffic is lower. But I can also then go out to other places like a sporting event or a rock concert or something and also win customers. So I'm chasing the customers wherever they are. And this is a good example of dislocation because I'm using the fact that you're locked into one place as your weakness. The third way of competing then is what we call disruption. And you're going to see this a lot. In fact, you're seeing it now. And disruption is basically trying to create just enough disruption, distraction, annoyances, throwing grit in the gears. In fact, the little symbol we show up there is something getting into the gears and not allowing them to work well. This is protesting. This is people going out and being angry. This is people right now protesting the government, right? Disruption is about trying to get in your way just enough constantly by arguing about the source of your products or whether or not they're GMO certified or anything along those lines to keep you from being able to operate efficiently and effectively. This is what you do when you have nothing else to win with. You just distract until whoever you're competing against just can't compete effectively. So that's preemption, dislocation, and disruption, and obviously most powerful sort of to least powerful in terms of how you act as a maneuver strategist. Now, all that said, that assumes a few things. Preemption, dislocation, disruption, those assume a few things. They assume that you're good at or you're capable of doing the four things we talked about earlier. Being able to move at speed, being able to move with agility, being able to innovate a new solution that people want, or in some cases, just a new channel or business model. There's nothing, the product of Airbnb is not new. It's the service and experience and business model that's new. But they did have to innovate something. So can we then understand what it's going to take to be able to do these things effectively? Let's talk about a couple of these. Insight, one that might be important to people who do knowledge management. Maneuver, what we've described as maneuver, is not possible. It is, in fact, probably impossible unless you have good insight, not about what's just happened, but what's about to happen. How do I begin to predict how things are emerging or evolving, what future trends are happening, what the competitive landscape is going to look like? And I need that insight in order to be able then to decide and then to be able to move quickly. So to be in this maneuver world, one of the things that we know that a lot of larger firms who are more effective at being efficient, what they're going to miss is what's happening next and how do I take advantage of it? And it's not just having the information, it's being able to digest it and make decisions based on it. And this is what a lot of companies miss. They have the information, they don't know how to digest it and synthesize it and make good decisions quickly. So this is probably one of the most critical things that we talk about when we talk about maneuver. So what I want to do for just a second then is, if you're following me so far, if you're buying into what I'm telling you, then you should be asking the next question. Okay, if the guys back at the ranch who are jealous of me coming here for a couple of days and getting to come to DC, if they ask me about this event that I was at, how would I tell them about how to compete? Right? I want you all to go back and tell your product managers, hey, here's what you should be doing. Everybody want to do that? Everybody good with that? This is yes. This is no. I'm getting a lot of, okay. What I want to do is break down a competitor for you in sort of 3 easy steps. How would I know how to attack a competitor and whether or not I could use maneuver against them? In my industry, if I'm in the pharma industry, or if I'm in the building trades, or if I'm in, I don't know, office supplies, how would I know whether or not I could compete against someone using the tactics we've talked about? This chart, unfortunately, is a little small, but it will tell you how we think about targeting a competitor. So there's sort of 4 factors we look at. The first one is, what are their strategies? Can I compete against their strategy or their business model? Airbnb looked at the hotels and said, well, their business model says that they have to either have built the building or have licensed the building. They had everything else. They had the reservation systems, the payment systems, the branding systems, et cetera, et cetera. They could have even given me points. Marriott could have even given me points for staying in your home. But their business model locked them into a particular way of thinking around the world. The other thing I can look at is what kind of things are required in order to fulfill that. So there's certain tangible things that have to be required, and this is the way the industry is fighting back against Airbnb. These tangible requirements are things like cleanliness and safety and the ability to process a credit card. Those are minimum requirements for any business in the hotel industry. I have to know that my room's clean and safe and I can pay for it, et cetera, et cetera. This is actually where where the hand is with the tangible requirements. That's what the industry is fighting back on Airbnb, and they're saying, there's a tangible requirement around some legal issues that you guys didn't think about, and that's how they're fighting back. This is table stakes, this minimum things that you need in order to compete. Another thing I can look at is this idea of, in the middle there, although it's kind of small again, is what we call intangibles. So one was tangible things, the other is intangibles. What about my brand, my culture, my creativity, my ideas, my intellectual property is either better than yours or faster than yours, or just gives me some advantage, right? So you can compete against the requirements, you can compete against the intangibles. Now here's the last one, is what everybody always competes on, products. Right, everybody says, well, you've got a shampoo and I've got a shampoo. You've got it in a 12-ounce bottle, I'll put it in the 12-ounce bottle and the 18-ounce bottle. What we tend to do as competitors, when we look at who we're going to compete against, is we run right over to the little briefcase and we say, well, you've got a product, I've got a product. We don't look at competing against these other 3 attributes at all. What does your strategy lock you into? How can I take advantage of that? What tangible factors are you competing on that you believe are required that I might be able to skirt? What intangibles or knowledge do I have that I can compete on that you can't, or give me an advantage? Instead of looking at all 4 of these things, we just look at the one thing. You have a product, then I need to match that product. So these are vulnerabilities, or areas of vulnerabilities that we can attack. So, as I said, there's a lot of different kinds of things here. I won't spend a lot more time on it, but you've got the tangible requirements, intangibles, and the offerings. And most people spend all their time on the offerings. And what isn't is strategies as well. What you want to do is you say, if this maneuver thing makes sense to me, is can I find a weakness, a gap, an unfulfilled opportunity against any of those things, and then can I attack it? How do I attack it? So if we go back to Airbnb, or let's use another one. Let's use Zara. Most of you are familiar with Zara, the clothing company? They're European. So Zara basically, okay, so let's 2 minutes on Zara. Zara is basically like H&M or Uniqlo. There's a couple of firms that are like them, which are fast fashion. So Zara basically comes into a space and says, we're going to turn our fashions every 6 to 12 weeks. Maybe sometimes as little as 4 to 5 weeks. We're going to have very fast fashion. We're going to find something, we're going to copy it, we're going to put it in the store and make it affordable. But what we're also going to do is we're going to have really excellent supply chain management. So what they're trying to do is be a fashion house that's not a fashion house. Because the fashion houses say, well, you have a spring line and a fall line. You want the fall line? You need to wait 6 months. Zara's like, you want the fall line? We'll figure that out. We'll get there faster. So they're competing against some of the fashion houses using speed and timeliness. Whereas the fashion houses basically say, well, we have a fall line and a spring line, and you'll have to wait. So you can use any of these kinds of ideas as a competitive advantage. So from that perspective, then, there are a couple of things that I want to talk about because I'm leading you to these kinds of what we'll call tactics. When you use maneuver, the ideas that we're advocating, there are sort of 5 different kinds of things that you can use to your benefit. What I mean by that is if you found a vulnerability somewhere in your competitors, their capabilities, their strategies, their intangibles or their tangibles, or even their products, there are ways that I can then choose to go compete. And I just talked about one. The first one was temporal. I can use time to my advantage. For example, in the US, there's this theory around everybody know when new cars come out? August, right? New cars come out in August. Well, Tesla says, well, the heck with that. We're going to bring them out whenever we want. We'll bring out a new model whenever we want. And instead, if you're waiting to see if GM's going to counter that, you're going to have to wait until next August. Why? Because that's the model that GM and Ford and Chrysler settled on years ago. Does it make sense? Do we have to have new cars just in August? No. But now that I know that that's your business model and that's what you're attuned to and that's what the things that you do, that's what they look like, then I'm going to try to change that. So I'm going to compete on time. And I just talked about how Zara, that fashion house, is also trying to compete on time. You're only going to bring out your product for spring and fall. I'm going to bring out a new product every 4 to 6 weeks. I'm going to compete with you on speed. The second one there was psychological. How do I win and overcome either your psychology or your customer psychology? In the book, one of my favorite examples that Alex brought up was there's a chicken restaurant firm in Guatemala, and Kentucky Fried Chicken goes in to compete with them. And so how does a small firm in Guatemala compete with this worldwide global enterprise that's known for chicken? Well, they're not going to beat them on quality necessarily. They're not going to beat them on price. They're not going to beat them on branding. So what they do is they go right to their customers and say, yeah, but where are the chickens from? Right? Our chickens are from Guatemala. We raise them here, and you're Guatemalan, and you should support Guatemalan chicken. Now, is Guatemalan chicken better than American chicken? No, but what are they playing to? National interest, pride, local sourcing. They're playing to a lot of different things. Maybe they're saying, well, you should eat Guatemalan chicken because we're a Guatemalan restaurant. Or maybe they're saying, well, locally sourced means it's better. Or maybe they're saying, maybe those chickens from the US, we're not really sure what's in them. You know, maybe there's some sort of, maybe they get some sort of injections or something, so it's not healthy. But the thing they're doing is putting enough doubt into their customers' minds about the product or the provenance or the relevance of that chicken to say, even though Kentucky Fried Chicken is bigger and has more branding and has more money, has all this stuff, you should eat our chicken. And they eventually chased Kentucky Fried Chicken out of the marketplace. Think about that. A little Guatemalan company using psychological disruption, chasing a large branded company out of the country using psychological disruption. That's what they did. So you've got time, you've got psychology, you've got positional. The positional question is, can I take a position or can I create a position in the marketplace that is more valuable than the position you have? And here we'll go back to Verdun for a second. The French built Verdun right on the edge of France. Right? It's right there where if you're in Germany and you're coming into France, it's right there. So I have this position. And the Germans could say one of two things. That position is so important that I have to have it, or I have to find a way to make that position irrelevant. So the question now you ask is, does my competitor have a position that I either need to take, because the natural inclination that most businesses have is when my competitor has a position, I want to go take it. I want to take that position. I want to take that market share from them. The other question we can ask is there a way I can make that position or that market share irrelevant? Can I make that channel irrelevant? Right? So who did that well? Where'd you buy your last book? Other than what you're going to buy after this speech. Although the books are available on Amazon too. Amazon did this, right? Amazon did this. Or Netflix did this. Think about going into the movie rental business 10 or 15 years ago. You look around in every street corner, there's a Blockbuster, right? I'm crazy to go into this business because they got all the good real estate locked up, right? All the good real estate's locked up. Well, Netflix comes along and says, what if we make the location irrelevant? What if we make your position irrelevant? How do I do that? Well, I put the movie in your mailbox first, and then eventually I download it to you. And now all those Blockbusters are now restaurants or workout facilities or something else, because Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore because their model was based on having lots of locations. They played positionally. Does that make sense? They tried to conquer the market from a positional standpoint. And Netflix said, that's your biggest weakness, and we're going to attack that. We've got a couple others here. The last one I'll talk about is informational. This is one maybe that have some resonance with you, which is, how do I use information more effectively than my competitors? What does information tell me? How do I use the information to win? And this is actually one of the areas that I think is really interesting. I'll give you one example. We were working with a life insurance company. And if any of you know life insurance, you know that basically there isn't any innovation left in life insurance. We know how long people are going to live. We know why people are going to die. We know basically the average longevity. We know if you take certain drugs or you smoke, you're going to have a less lifespan, et cetera, et cetera. There's not a lot of opportunity in the term life industry to do a lot of innovation. So we said, well, what if you took 100 years, because this company had been in business for 100 years, what if you took 100 years of mortality data that you have and you figured out how to use that information to help other companies build products and services? You have more information than just about any company around how people have lived and died for the last 100 years. There's a lot of value in that information. And the folks looked at us and said, but we're not a data company. Right? We're not a data company. And I think the largest asset they have is that information, and if they use it effectively, they could create new products and services that completely outstrip their existing their insurance market. Instead, they're locked into the way they think about it. So somebody's going to come along and compete with them on information. These are the things then, once you've found a weakness, once you've found a vulnerability, then you can begin to decide how to attack. So we talked about sort of, just go back and recap it, we talked about preemption and dislocation and disruption as ways to attack. When you decide how you want to attack, then you can use one or more of these things to actually attack a competitor, their product, the competition, et cetera, et cetera. These are the actual tactics that you would use. So let's go back and think a little bit about this. You need to see opportunities before others do. I have to be smarter, not about what has happened in the past, but what's likely to emerge. That's insight. I need to be able to understand that. As I said, most of your companies have data and they have the ability to look forward. They're not doing it. They're not doing it effectively. And trust me, we've worked with a lot of Fortune 500 firms. They have a lot of data. They have a lot of information even about what's likely to occur, but they're not synthesizing it and using it effectively. The second thing is, can I act while other companies are still gathering themselves, when they're still preparing to act or getting ready to act or budgeting it for next year? That's speed. Can I act in a way that allows me to be agile, because there's going to be things that happen that I don't plan for, and I need to be able to course correct, but I need to be able to course correct at speed. And that's agility. And when I get there before everybody else, am I going to have something that really matters to them? And that's innovation. So these are the factors that sort of go into maneuver and why we think that this is important from a competitive position. Just to go back to Airbnb for a second. Let's go back and see if it met all that criteria. There's a huge opportunity in terms of people being willing to rent their bedrooms or a spare room or whatever. So there is an opportunity, and they saw that opportunity. In fact, they lived that opportunity. They were the first Airbnb. The guys who created Airbnb, they created the first airbed and rented it out. They built it, they prototyped it, and they went fast. Once they figured out there was a market, they went really fast with this. So speed is important. They got out before most cities were even aware that there was a problem. Right now, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and right now the city council is meeting to talk about, what do we do about Airbnb? Do we allow it? Don't we allow it? Do we tax it? Do we not tax it? However, there's thousands of places you can stay in Raleigh. They got out there before anybody could even react. So they were more agile and more rapid than anybody could ever have imagined. And they really built a completely new business model in the face of companies that should have probably won this first. So that's an example. We have others in the book. Let me just conclude, and I'll take a few questions. The fact of the matter is that if HP of all companies, if the CEO of HP can recognize how important speed is, you know speed's important. They get it. We all get it. We've got to move much faster. But we've got to move faster with insight and intelligence and agility. Attrition is the opposite of that. Attrition is about matching product per product, feature for feature. It's a slow grind. And most companies are really set up well to do the slow grind. But the market doesn't want that. The market doesn't expect that. So speed, agility, insight, and innovation are what are going to allow you to compete more effectively in what we believe is this emerging marketplace. Okay, I have reached the end of my questions. My comments? No, I haven't.
This is Wednesday. Say thank you.